In the year 2020, millions of people in the English-speaking world are engaged in reflections on how and why the Star Wars sequence of films degenerated into garbage. I think it's a meaningful area of analysis, even if you regard the Star Wars films themselves as meaningless. I think it leads us to some useful observations about the gap between how investors see cultural production and how artists see cultural production, and the gap between artists and the audience. Because ultimately, neither the artist, nor the investor, nor the loudest voices in the audience really identify what it is that made the work of art special or worthwhile in the first place. In the year 1980, there was a movie called American Gigolo. I'm about to make it sound way more interesting than it actually was. What was it that made this film special in the year 1980? What was it that made it a big deal? From the perspective of the investors, most likely they were expecting the film to earn money because of its sexual content. It discussed sex in a manner that was very provocative and boundary-pushing for the year 1980. It had nudity on screen. It had a good-looking cast in states of undress. It was also set in a world of wealth and privilege. The costume and wardrobe department featured a lot of designer clothes, so on and so forth. So in the same way that investors might pay for a soap opera on Mexican television, you can imagine that when they were looking at the checklist of factors that made this film likely to earn back the money or turn a profit on the investment, those might be the sorts of things they were looking at. But the truth is, this film was a hit, and this film was appreciated and remembered by critics and so on, because it was built around a philosophical idea. Now, that philosophical idea is not tremendously deep or complex. You basically see it on screen right now in this one quotation from dialogue from the film. The whole film is built around that one idea. Okay, this guy has a sense of his own exceptionalism, of his own super moral purpose of being above the law, and then we get to see the consequences of that as the plot plays out. Now, you can imagine if this film had created a series of sequels like the Star Wars movie franchise, it would be very easy for investors to say, yes, let's have another film with a lot of blunt discussion of human sexuality. Let's have another film set amidst wealth and privilege with designer clothes. Let's have first-rate cinematography. Let's have a lot of nudity. Let's keep going with American Gigolo 2, 3, and 4. Let's do American Gigolo, the prequel trilogy. Let's have American Gigolo co-starring Jar Jar Binks. It's going to be great. We're going to make millions of dollars. All those obvious, tangible, money-making elements are easy for investors to appreciate, and you can lose sight of the fact that, you know what? This movie had one very simple philosophical idea, and the whole script was built around a set of reflections on that one philosophical idea, and that's the only thing that made this film memorable. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of naked bodies and designer clothes, and who cares? I'm going to say the same thing, more or less, about the film adaptation of Gone with the Wind. You can imagine investors sitting down and trying to make a franchise out of this, try to have Gone with the Wind 2, The Empire Strikes Back, and thinking, you know why this film was a big hit? Because it had fancy costumes, because it had hot chicks and handsome men, and the simmering sexual tension between them. And that would be wrong. The film version of Gone with the Wind, and I'm willing to accept this is different from the novels in a significant way, the film version of Gone with the Wind was built around the philosophical tension created by Rhett Butler. There's a contrast introduced right at the beginning of the film between Rhett Butler and a younger, more handsome, more idealistic man. And in fact, they basically both want the same girl. And Rhett Butler doesn't believe in nationalism. He doesn't believe in any of the romantic nonsense that young people are, getting excited about at the start of the Civil War. And the reason for that is this completely nihilistic economic analysis of where the factories are, and whoever has the factories that make the guns is going to win this war, etc., etc. And this idealistic younger man has this kind of nonsense about how a gentleman won't be defeated by a commoner, sort of aristocratic, medieval way of thinking about honor and nobility. And Rhett Butler lets you know he doesn't believe in nobility. He doesn't believe in being a gentleman. He believes in playing to win, fighting to survive. He isn't working for the South, and he isn't working for America, and he isn't working for some ideal about a brighter future. Rhett Butler is in it for Rhett Butler. He's in it to win it. He's working for himself. And you get this contrast between the ideals of other characters, the ideals of the underlying or surrounding society, and Rhett Butler's brutal, nihilistic, self-interested philosophy. And that's what makes a series of scenes at fancy dress parties interesting, okay? A bunch of hot chicks in expensive dresses is boring, okay? There would be nothing interesting about those scenes early in the film if it didn't have this kind of philosophical and political tension, in part created by or in part illustrated by Rhett Butler. Rhett Butler, nihilistic, atheist, self-centered asshole in a world of pious hypocrites. This same problem with sequels missing the point, not understanding what it was philosophically that made this scenario worth watching in the first place, happened within the TV series Game of Thrones, right? Like, in earlier seasons, they had success ultimately because the show was built around a number of simple but genuinely interesting philosophical and political ideas. And then once you got past season 4, maybe when you got past season 5, it had degenerated into this investor's perspective of, you got hot chicks in fancy dresses. You got red-haired girls taking off their clothes and showing their bodies. You got big, muscular dudes with swords having sword fights. Like, that's what sells this show. That's why this show is a success. And that's just not true. That is not what made Game of Thrones worth watching at all. One of the most dramatic and rapid examples of this kind of degeneration of a film that had one or two good philosophical ideas into complete garbage was the original cinema adaptation of Conan the Barbarian. Now, again, sort of parallel to what I just said about American Gigolo. If you haven't already seen this movie, don't watch it. It's just not that interesting. But the first Conan the Barbarian film was built around a number of philosophical ideas, basically from Nietzsche. Nietzsche, and there's a little bit from the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. But again, you could probably just take a few short quotations from this film and show the whole script, the whole drama is built around a couple of philosophical ideas that are a little bit provocative, a little bit interesting. And then what happened with the sequels? The sequels degenerated into complete garbage immediately because the people investing in it thought, big muscles, big swords. Their interpretation of what made this film successful or special or worth watching was 100% wrong. Philosophically, the original 1977 Star Wars very much emerged from the shadow of the novel Dune by Frank Herbert, came out in 1965. But the philosophical differences from Dune are even more important than the similarities. Dune, written in 1965, was fundamentally interested in a future built around Islamic philosophy. When people read Dune in 1965, most white, Western, English-speaking people had never heard the word jihad before. There was a lot of overtly Muslim, ideology and jargon in this book. Talked about jihad thousands and thousands of years into the future, a technologically advanced future where still the brutal simplicity of the Muslim worldview seemed to be dominant. And politically, Frank Herbert has characters saying in the Dune series, I'm sorry, I forget if this is in the first novel or not, that, people just prefer to live under tyranny because they would rather have a government they hate rather than democracy. So there's something implicitly shocking about the idea that in the future we're going to go back to feudalism, all right? And Frank Herbert's Dune had that shock effect. For many people, seeing Star Wars, that was part of what was shocking about it. What do you mean in the future there's a princess? Government is about princesses and emperors. So in the future we have all this advanced technology, but we've gone back to the Dark Ages politically. What do you mean? But in Star Wars, the script was not built around Muslim concepts the way Dune was. Instead, the very first Star Wars movie was built around loosely adapted philosophy from Taoism and Buddhism, including, by the way, the jargon, in the same way that Dune directly used Arabic terms, sometimes changing the spelling slightly. In the same way, actually, George Lucas evidently took a vacation in Thailand, and he has Pali and Sanskrit terminology from Thai Buddhism misspelled in a manner that reflects the way people in Thailand pronounce Buddhist terms, okay? That includes the origin of the word Jedi. Do you want me to break this stuff down for you? Not worth explaining. But yes, a lot of the ideas in Star Wars were vaguely inspired by Taoism and Southeast Asian Buddhism, but in this breathtakingly brutal, feudal future where for no stated reason, humanity has forgotten about democracy and has returned to, slavery, outright slavery, as well as some kind of political structure from the Dark Ages. That's interesting. That's provocative. When that first film came out, there were a whole lot of things that had nothing to do with, spaceships blowing each other up. That was really provocative and interesting and memorable. It seemed to raise a lot of really meaningful questions about the future and about our society and where it's going here and now. But if you want to know what happened to Star Wars and why it degenerated into garbage, I think we can never forget that as good as the first film in 1977 was, it was evident that nobody in the creative team understood what was good about it as early as 1978 when they made the Star Wars Holiday Special, okay? The 1978 Star Wars Holiday Special is, to the 1977 Star Wars, just as brutal and baleful a contrast as the sequels to Conan the Barbarian were to the original Conan the Barbarian. Good writing is finite, bad writing is infinite. The difference between the two is the stroke of an editor's pen. You got three different groups of people who fight over the future of a franchise. They're the creative artists, including the authors, there are the investors, and then there are people in the audience. But the people in the audience themselves very often fail to apprehend philosophically or politically what it is they're getting excited about, what it is they're responding to. There can be people in the audience, millions of them, who just watched the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones and say, wow, great, dragons, swords, muscles, nudity. They can be giving that message loud and clear to the corporation creating this crap, and the corporation gets the message, and the investors hear what they want to hear, and they move in that direction. It's maybe harder to hear the voices from the audience to say, hey, you know what? The reason why this is a hit, the reason why this matters and is meaningful in the culture has nothing to do with the boobs and the swords and the dragons. It actually has to do with questions that are being raised philosophically and politically. And if you lose that spark, then you lose the intrigue and interest that made people overlook everything that was wrong with the first movie, or everything that was wrong with the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, everything that motivated the audience to put up with the bullshit that, let's face it, always was there in any of this schlock, mediocre mainstream culture.